Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. So I see a whole bunch of questions saved up here. Let's see. Lola asks, how long should someone expect to wait before a new business becomes profitable? Well, depends on how long you can afford to wait, in part. If you have outside investment, if you're using your own money, these are all things that affect that. I mean, if you have outside investment and you kind of have a fixed amount of investment and you're really not going to be able to get new investment in any reasonable way until the business is profitable, that gives you kind of a time scale. But realistically, in the world of seed capital, venture capital, all these kinds of things, there is, in my opinion, a somewhat depressingly large amount of leeway often granted to how long it can take before a business becomes profitable. And it's even some of the largest and most successful businesses have chosen not to be profitable for a really, really long time, kind of shoveling in more and more investment money and just sort of building things up to the point where they can sort of pop out and be super profitable. I mean, that's certainly true with Amazon over the course of a large number of years. I remember when Google was young, I have to say I never believed that they would sort of come out of having burnt, $100 million now in much more money in today's terms, and sort of be going fast enough at the bottom of that roller coaster ride that they would pop up the other side and be successful. I mean, to me, I've always been something of a believer of trying to make businesses where they sort of make more money than they spend as soon as possible. And I think it really depends on the type of business you're trying to build. If you're trying to build kind of a Silicon Valley style business where in the end, it's not clear it ever has to be profitable. It could be that the business is, keeps on shoveling in investment money and eventually it gets sold even when it isn't profitable. And sometimes it gets sold to people who are investors in the company that it's sold to. And it's all a very complicated kind of a piece of sort of circular economy, so to speak. I think that's a model of doing business. There's kind of another end of that spectrum, which is the kind of thing I've done with our company over the last 38 years or so, which is to have a company without investors that is really fueled by its own internal revenues. And at the beginning of our company, it was about, I guess started in about August of 1986. And we had, deals done by when was it? Probably the late in 1987 or early in 1988. And then we started shipping product in the middle of 1988 and rapidly became actually very profitable at the very beginning. That was a matter of a year and a half of building product and getting to the point where we could start to sell it. And we were fortunate that there was a lot of kind of pent up demand for the product that we built, and things got off to a good start. So I don't have a great answer to that. I think, as I say, there are different models of making companies, some of which include never being really profitable and always being kind of bring in more investment money and make it to some exit without becoming profitable. Not my kind of way of doing business, but something that is pretty common in the Silicon Valley world and so on. Let's see. Simonik asks, in your personal and professional journey, what are important things you learnt the hard way? Oh boy. I've been around a while here, so there are lots of things where there are things one learns. I'm not sure. There are things, for example, here's something. Don't do a project you're not interested in. Don't do a project you think is really kind of just easy and you just have to turn the crank and make it come out. My experience, at least with my personality, that doesn't work very well. The project that, in order for a project to be successful, you have to be really invested in it, enthusiastic about it, care about it. That's my experience, at least. The few times in my life when I've ended up doing projects where it's like, yeah, I can do this. It's kind of a worthwhile thing to do, but I don't really care that much about it. Those have not been either. In most cases, they haven't been particularly successful projects in the outside world. They certainly haven't been successful for me personally. That's one thing. Another thing I suppose, learnt is there are settings in which I do well. There are settings in which I don't do well. There are kinds of things I like to do. There are kinds of things I don't like to do. I've kind of learnt what those are. Every one of those that I learnt what it was, I tried doing something and decided it wasn't a good idea. Um, and for me, there are things like I am perfectly comfortable running things. I am not a particularly good kind of committee consensus, kind of collective type of person. And I find, if somebody says, "Will you be on a committee to study this?" The correct answer from me should be no, because it isn't my personality. I mean, I tend to, I'm just fine at doing something which maybe some other people don't find so easy, which is sort of taking responsibility and just deciding what to do. I get, if I'm in a situation where I'm kind of like, oh, well, it's a consensus being, I mean, I obviously work with lots of people at our company and elsewhere, where it's working with them. But when it's kind of like, this is going to be a committee and everybody's going to vote and all this kind of thing, it's I have a hard time with that, and I end up personally, I mean, just my own limitations, I suppose. I either just zone out. It's like, well, everybody's talking, and I don't, I don't really have, I'm not really going to engage, or I end up dominating the discussion, and I'm like, I end up in a few situations where I am involved in things like this, like boards of companies and so on. There's a terrible tendency for me to just sort of start kind of holding forth. I suppose that's what I end up doing in these live streams too. And I think often people are like, "Hey, that's great. It's useful input." And sometimes it's like that's totally disruptive to sort of this collective effort that we're making. And so I tend not to involve myself in kind of versions of that where it doesn't really fit the things that I'm able to do. So it's kind of like one can't buck one's own personality too much. And in building organizations, the personality of the founder is inevitably imprinted on the organization. And you kind of get to see that there are things which you're just not that interested in or not that good at. And guess what? The organization is not that interested or not that good at that. So I suppose there are sort of a few things. I mean, what are some other things? I suppose, one positive thing I've sort of learned, I guess, is, in interacting with people, more so than organizations, people, that, being reasonable and acting with integrity is just a good thing. And I've sort of naturally done that for a really, really long time. And it just turns out that, 20 years later, 30 years later, that thing that you did where you did the right thing comes back, and it's a good thing to have done. In addition to feeling good about doing it at the time, it has a good effect later on. I suppose another thing that again has been something that has gone right, not wrong, is kind of keeping track of people. There are people that I've known over the course of half a century, where it's kind of like one sort of stays in touch, and it turns out at some point it it's things are it was worthwhile, and it was both personally and potentially professionally and so on. I guess that the cost to stay in touch is not high. Another thing that's a positive thing one learns is, okay, there's somebody one knew 25 years ago, and there's a reason to be back in touch. And so you're back in touch. And almost always it's like, oh, that's nice, back in touch, how nice. And you kind of go on from where you left off, so to speak. And it's not like, the oh my gosh, I can't get back in touch with this person. I haven't been in touch with them for 25 years. You should get over that, because turns out most of the time people are like, oh, that's nice, nice to hear from you type thing. What are some other things I've learned? I don't know. There are things where, again, not doing things that one doesn't want to do. So I'll give you an example. Or that one isn't interested in. For example, I do hopelessly little investing and I tried it years and years ago, and I realized I just wasn't that interested in it, didn't pay enough attention, and you can't make it work well unless you're paying a lot of attention, and it's just not something I'm terribly interested in. So I don't do it. Another thing that I learn sort of repeatedly is when there's some domain that you've never been involved in, some area of professional expertise or whatever you've never been involved in, and suddenly you're kind of, for whatever reason, you need to be involved in that. What I found is that one has to have a certain degree of humility in getting into the thing, because there's always a way of thinking in that particular area that one just doesn't have. And one can absolutely apply sort of general thinking skills to say, wait a minute, I need to understand the answer to that question. That's something quite generic. It's kind of like you, the expert, are telling me something. I don't understand what you're telling me. I'm going to insist on understanding it. That's something generic. But it's like, well, let me tell you, says the expert, in our business, it always works this or that way. Well, I don't believe in kind of taking that as a given. On the other hand, I do believe in understanding enough about the way of thinking in that business that I can come to the same conclusion, and realizing that you can't just sort of dive in and not expect to have to kind of learn the way of thinking in that particular area. A few thoughts, at least. Let's see. Martin asks, can you elaborate on some of the unique talents within your team, perhaps extremely smart or methodical and disciplined people? I'm lucky enough that in the 800 or so people in our company, we have a lot of very wonderfully talented people who, in many cases, I've kind of accumulated or recruited over the course of many, many years. And also we have kind of pipelines of new people that we end up getting exposed to through things like our summer schools and other programs like that. I think one of the things that different organizations do differently is kind of how personally can you deal with people, so to speak? How much can you deal with diverse personalities and so on? There are certainly organizations where it's very much like every person is sort of a plug compatible, software engineer or whatever else. And they're all sort of qualified in certain ways, and they fit into a slot. To a large extent in the organization I built, we tend to have a more personal approach, in the sense that there's quite a range of different personalities, and there's a very great range of different expertise. In the kinds of things that we do, building Wolfram language, building Wolfram Alpha, trying to make a knowledge base that sort of covers the world. Yes, we have to have people who have, PhDs in chemistry. We have to have people who are experts in linguistics, history, as well as DevOps and software engineering, as well as other kinds of things. So our particular company has very diverse collection of skills embedded in it. Not only skills, but also personalities. And I think one of the things that I always find important in putting together projects is you've got to know enough about the people that you're trying to assemble into some kind of project team, or at least indirectly know enough through knowing the managers of people who you can rely on to sort of describe the individual people, that you can sort of build a team that can be effective. And when you take a person, that the different kinds of people, I always think one of the things about people is sort of a parameter of people, or at least at times in people's lives, is the size of project that they are optimized for, which can range from a 15-minute project to a multi-year project. And, the person who's optimized for the 15-minute project, put them in a role That's an on the front lines problem solving role, technical support, DevOps, something like that, where it's a big win if, question comes in, okay, let's answer it, 15 minutes, we're done. Okay, next question comes in, and that kind of pipeline versus the person who's like, look, I want to build this very perfect system and framework for what I'm doing. It's going to take me 2 months to get started, but then I'm going to build this framework that's going to let us do amazing things over the course of the next 2 years. If you misplace people in terms of, for example, that parameter, you get silly results. I mean, the person who is the 15-minute person will come into the 2-year project and it's like, well, I can do a piece of this and I'll do it in a day, but it's not the right thing, and doesn't have that systematic build out. The person who likes systematic build out, you feed them into something that's like, we need this in a day, and they'll basically say, I just can't do this. I need to build all the structure. So, and there also are situations where there are people, in terms of managing people, one always finds that there are people where it's always very calm and everybody is just having a nice civilized discussion. Then there are people where you really have to be pretty forceful and everybody's violently disagreeing, and then come to some resolution that's a good resolution, and sort of the end result is probably the same. The way you got there is different and somewhat personality dependent. I think the thing that, again, another thing is how careful are people? How much, there are people who write poetic code. It's beautiful, takes a while. And there are people who you feed them something, and the great news is they'll actually go and be able to do something. Even if it isn't perfect, they'll be able to do something on a wide variety of different areas. And it's really a management question, how you feed those people into the right places. The poetic code writer is great for sort of the core internal code that's going to be called 1 trillion times over the course of the next few years. But they're not good for the, hey, let's make this kind of proof of concept thing in this area where we're really kind of hacking through the jungle to make something that hasn't been made before, and vice versa, so to speak. I mean, you find out that sometimes you end up with projects where it really was a proof of concept project, but it actually works. And then if it's been built, and it's just a tricky thing because you have to then make the decision: do you start rebuilding, re-engineering the thing, or do you try and build on the kind of just let's race to get it together type work that was originally done? I think that in our particular organization, for example, sort of self-motivation is pretty important. We're a very geo-distributed organization, and it just doesn't work very well if people don't kind of sort of stay self-motivated fairly well. And I think that again, in our particular organization, it's the sort of it's kind of, there are sort of maybe regular checkpoints. Many teams have daily meetings and so on, but it's not the case that people are kind of, you're at your desk in the office and people are watching you all the time type thing, or implicitly so. And there isn't that same kind of driver of, hey, I should be working now type thing. So it has to really be motivation from within, which when it's there, I think is sort of more powerful than anything else. And that's an important thing but it really depends. There are different situations and different people. There are people where, well, I knew there were people before COVID, there were people where they just couldn't work except in the office. Then they were kind of pulled out of the office during the kind of COVID period, and some of them didn't really do very well. Others kind of learnt how to work in a self-motivated way and have continued doing that. Let's see. Lemon asks, can you tell us about exciting projects you're working on right now? Oh boy, too many. In science, in technology, some organizational things, really, really too many. I think I'll just Yeah. So maybe I'll come back to that if we have a chance here. Um, Boy, Mick asks, what do I think about self-driving? Do I think that Tesla's approach without LIDAR has legs, or is the Google Waymo hardware intense approach more promising? Um, you know, I'm not sure. My impression is that the sort of fusion of all these different sensors is pretty non-trivial, and it may be better to sort of pick one modality and go with it. I think, the times I've driven or driven in self-driving cars, they seem to be getting progressively get better. And I have to say, the one time I was driving with somebody who was a former person in one of the leading self-driving car groups, and uh, he was having the car drive, and it was kind of interesting to see when he was about to grab the wheel, when it didn't seem obvious to me that there was anything particularly controversial happening. And so that was sort of an interesting data point in the world of self-driving. Um, I think I do remember back in 1980, I think, maybe 1979, running into a chap called Marvin Minsky, who was sort of an AI pioneer. For some reason, I think I was driving, and Marvin was expounding on, real soon now, there'll be cars that drive themselves. Well, that was 1980, and the real soon hasn't quite happened convincingly yet. And anyway, uh, uh, it's interesting to see kind of these technology curves and what works and what doesn't. But I could expound on some more details of the technology, but I think maybe this isn't the venue for doing that. Let's see. JYO asks, any tips for building a strong customer base from scratch? I think often the best products, almost always actually, the best products are products you want to use. In other words, if you're founding a company and you say, well, I'm never going to use this, but other people will use it, let's build this. That's not a good sign. In the things I've built, I really wanted to use them, and I do use them. And that's a good start. So in a sense, your customer base is in some approximation people like you. They're people who will use your product like you use your product. That's one thing. Another thing to say is, and I think that really helps in terms of having communication to potential customers and so on. And I think another thing is, if there's sort of a captive kind of sort of bubble of the world where you already know those people, or you have some particular connection to those people. You're part of some organization, professional society, community, whatever else, where you kind of already know those people. You're connected. You're known to those people. Then that's a place which is a good place to start in terms of building a customer base. And I think that's usually when it's a question of just spray things out in the world and hope they catch on, that's a more difficult thing. I mean, it can happen, particularly when there's a thing about the product which is kind of very, the soundbite, people understand what the soundbite says, and they say, hey, I want one of those. That's another place where that really helps. But I think the idea that there's just sort of a machine where you just run a bunch of ads and the customers will come, I don't know, that's always seemed rather unconvincing to me. I think, as I say, starting from communities that you understand well and perhaps are connected well to is a good thing to do. Hy-Vee asks, what's the best way to figure out pricing for a new product or service? Yeah, sometimes you just have to throw a dart. I mean, there are some basics. How much it costs you to make? Does it have incremental cost every time you sell one of it? Is there going to be cost associated with supporting it? How much is it going to cost in terms of the cost of sales? How many people have to visit how many people to be able to sell this thing? Those are sort of some basic constraints. But then in the end, it's often you have to just make a guess. And yeah, you can ask people how much would you spend on this thing, and if it's an incremental product, that's probably a useful thing to do. If it's something new where they've never seen one of those before, nobody knows. I mean, people will say, "Oh, yeah, that's really useful. I'd spend all this money on it," and somebody else will say, "Well, I only will spend, a few dollars just because that's all I have or all I have available or whatever else." It's really kind of, in my experience, it's sort of it's not that useful to ask people that question. If you have uh, so, I will say there are times when we made silly mistakes in that kind of thing. I'll tell you one that's sort of embarrassing to relate from the early days of iOS apps. And we're building a Wolfram Alpha app. This is in 2009. And I have to blame Apple a bit for this, more than a bit. They were really trying to sort of establish the idea that there should be kind of premium sort of apps that did important things. And so there was kind of like, charge a lot for this app. It's really a good app. It really does important things. So when we first released that app, it was a $50 app. And there were apps for $1,000 at that time as well. But it turned out, so it was a $50 app, and we sold some of it, but it clearly wasn't a very good idea because it just wasn't. We were interested in getting lots of people actually using the technology we'd spent all this effort building, and so on, in a mobile app form. And so eventually we just said, to hell with it. We're reducing the price to $5, I think. The one thing that was incredibly surprising to me was the actual revenue we were getting in was surprisingly similar at the $5 an app and the $50 an app price points. Obviously, there were more people buying the $5 an app, but somehow it worked out to be more or less the same. I don't understand that. One learns in economics about elasticity of demand and things like this, but somehow the numbers, the product of the price and the number of people who are buying it was roughly constant. I have no idea if that applies anywhere else, but and I'll talk a little bit more about pricing. So another thing that was a surprise to me in terms of pricing, when we first released Mathematica in 1988, we had sort of differentiated pricing, because we really wanted to have a price point that was below $500 because that was kind of a key price point for productivity software. So we had a $495 price point, but then in those days, computers either did or didn't have a floating point unit. And if you had a floating point unit, then a bunch of computations could run a lot faster and so on. So we had a version that used the floating point unit. I think it cost $795. And the $495 sort of basic version didn't use the floating point unit. And, I thought, well, a lot of people are going to buy the $495 version. They didn't. Almost all the sales were the more expensive version. Now, that's possibly because it was somewhat early adopters, but it was also something where actually by the time they were going to buy it, they really wanted to have all its capabilities and they were prepared to buy the more expensive version. So that was something of a surprise to me in terms of pricing. I mean, it's also worth understanding that pricing is a certain amount of signaling. I mean, if there are multiple products in the marketplace and you say, I'm going to do well, I'm going to make it the cheapest product. Well, when people look at those multiple products and they see yours is the cheapest product, they're going to say, why is it the cheapest product? Is it not as good as these others? I mean, this is something that I have to say is complicated when you have a very kind of broad product, as we do with Wolfram Language, that there are many verticals in which we are much better than products that cost, $100,000 when we cost $1,000, let's say. And that's a hard thing to communicate. I will say in terms of pricing, let me make a couple of other comments. Another important piece of pricing is who are you selling to and what are their kind of critical price points in terms of the way they can buy what you have. So for example, let's say you're selling to businesses and there's a certain kind of threshold. You don't want to be selling with a price that's right above what the amount that a person at this level in the organization can sign for, because then that purchase always has to propagate up the organization and takes a lot longer and has a lot more grinding, and you might spend more money kind of having people interact with that bureaucracy than you would lose by having the price be slightly lower. So for B2B, business to business type stuff, I think that's an important consideration. What is the actual, who's actually going to buy it? What is their mechanism? How do those funds come to be available? What are the thresholds in those kinds of funds? When it's consumers, it really depends if you're in a space where people have an expectation or not. I mean, there are places where there's an expectation that it's quotes free, whatever that means, or where it's at least freemium, where the base thing is free, and then there's sort of you're progressively paying for other features. So, there are different expectations in different areas. If you have something which is sort of casting out in a new area, those expectations don't really exist, and you have more freedom about what to do. Let's see. Well, let's see. There's a question here from Larry saying, with your work on Wolfram Alpha and other projects, you've brought complex computational capabilities to the general public in accessible ways. What were some of the challenges in making such powerful tools user-friendly, and how do you think accessibility to high-level technology will shape industries in the future? Well, I always consider myself sort of the patient zero or customer zero for the products that we build. I want to be able to use them, and I want to be able to use them very smoothly in a very polished way. And I'm very uncompromising in the fact that I'm going to use it. I'm going to use it fast. I'm going to use it I'm going to bash all the corners, and I'm just going to really try and, use the heck out of it. And I do that with the products that we build. And I think that really helps to make polished products, is that you have the people who are really leading, building them, be also pushing those products hard. And I sent in, we're building a new product that will hopefully come out soon. I just demoed it internally to our company earlier today, and I'm happy to say the demo went, I thought, really well. But I was using that last night and for a few hours, and I must have sent in, I don't know, 20 sort of bug reports and complaints and things that need to be polished and so on. So that's an important thing. When it comes to how will people use things, you've just really got to think, and you've got to think through and try to get to the essence of how people are going to use what you're building. Not, oh yes, it's possible to get there. By swinging from tree to tree, you can sort of make it to the end and do a particular thing with the product. The question is it really kind of smooth? Do you really feel like you've got lots of power in your fingers, so to speak, as you use the product in this or that way? And, I think that's the thing to uncompromisingly push for. I remember Steve Jobs, who I knew, was very much into this kind of idea of just, drill to the essence of what the product is supposed to be doing and make sure that's the path. You can follow that path. It's very smooth. It's very clean to follow that path. Now, often when you're building things, you don't know exactly what the ultimate path that most people will take will be. You have to guess that. That's why it's important that you're a customer for your own product. But quite often, one will end up building all kinds of complicated castles in the sky of things that are like, well, you might want to do this, you might want to do that. I think the trick is to be a little bit, when you see those things and the product is close to being finished, you kind of have to dial back on those, maybe drop some of them, even though they were, the pride of some engineering effort. Another thing I will say about products is you often don't know what you have until the product is almost finished. I mean, one of the things that I do a lot is designing language design for Wolfram language and so on. And I've gotten, after 4 decades of experience, I'm reasonably good at imagining what it's going to be like when you build it. But I'm not perfect, even after all that experience. And when it comes to things that are more sort of user experience, clicky types of things rather than language design, it's more difficult to sort of foresee what it will feel like when you actually have it. And one of the things I tend to do is to kind of not prejudge too much about how things will work, just try to define a direction, start building in that direction. Then as you've started to build things, you actually use them and you say, wait a minute, this is, why am I having to click 3 times when I'm always going to really be doing this one thing? I just want to click once. Or, I'm using it and wait a minute, where is that button that's supposed to do this or that? I can't even find it. Well, it wasn't emphasized correctly in the UX. Or another thing, it's kind of like I suppose I try to do is kind of like act as clueless as I can as I try and actually sort of review UX and things like this. And what I mean by that is, I just say, what does this, little piece of text actually say? Let me imagine not knowing all the things I know, and what does this text mean? And can I understand it? And very often the answer is no. And then it's, well, we have to rewrite this. And it takes effort to do that. I mean, it's the effort to polish things well is really great. I mean, it's not a thing where even, as I say, with some kinds of things like language design, I can immediately say, somebody says, oh, there's this language design function that works like this. I can immediately say, that's not right. Look, there's this corner case where it's going to fail, and look, it doesn't fit in with these other things, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I can often say, then there's often a puzzle. Well, how do you make it right? I can see what's wrong. I don't necessarily know how to make it right. And it takes real intellectual work to make it right. I mean, a good example of where that shows up is naming of functions. It's like getting the right name for a function is very important in people being able to use that function correctly. But it can take hours and hours, and you can iterate for weeks kind of on until you get the name that people will understand, and it really has a huge benefit in terms of the usability of the thing you build. So it's a few thoughts about that. Yeah, Harry is commenting, if the CEO himself heavily uses the product, it's something special. Yeah, it's always, I mean, I'm always a little bit, when people don't use their own products, I'm always like, yeah, there's something a bit wrong here. I will say back in the day, and probably this is now late 1980s, early 1990s, I would go to tech conferences, and software industry conferences and things, and it was always it was a different time. It was a time when most of the management was not technical, where most CEOs of even tech companies were not themselves technical people. They were not people, and the shocking thing was actually at a lot of these conferences, the only folks who were demoing their own products were myself and Bill Gates. The time when Windows stopped supporting left-handed mice well was the time I realized Bill Gates is like me, actually left-handed, and so it's kind of like the CEO isn't using the thing as much if it isn't, if the left-handed mouse support doesn't really work. Maybe switch to using trackpads or something that don't require handedness of mice, but that's seemed like a bit of a tip-off there. Let's see. Let's see. Well, Ben asks, how do I personally define innovation? What makes something truly innovative instead of just a small improvement? I always like to think that some of the things I build are what one might call alien artifacts, things where nobody kind of imagined that a thing like that might exist, but where once you see it, it's like, oh yeah, that's an interesting thing. So those are places where I think sort of that's a good tip-off for innovation. I think that it's, there are things which are kind of in the flow of what's going to happen anyway. Somebody's going to do it. And there are things where if you don't do it, nobody will do it. Or maybe nobody will do it for 50 years. Those are good sort of indications of innovation. I think one has to be a little bit careful with that, because things that nobody will do it if you don't do it, and it might not be done ever or for 100 years or whatever. The problem with those things, and this is sort of the story of my life at some level, is you do those things and they're really, for me at least, very fun and fulfilling to do, but people don't necessarily understand what on earth it is. And it may be that, decades go by, and it's happened to me many times, decades go by from things I've done in both technology and in science, and eventually people are like, oh, that's what that is. That's really cool. And it's not like you changed the product at all. It was identical. The product was the same, but the world changed. And the world evolved to a point where, yes, they really understood what the point of that product that you built 20 years earlier actually was. Or in science, that idea that you had, or whatever. And it's not like, it's not that you're building a new version of the product, which is sort of, better, stronger, moderner. It's just that the world changed. So, but I think that's the challenge of sort of extreme innovation, is that you end up being sort of ahead of the world by many decades in some cases. And there's a question of sort of, can you survive that? Or does your company or whatever depend on the fact that, people have to understand it now? And then you can't sort of, you can't do that. I've had the good fortune of being able to just build innovative things sort of for the sake of building innovative things, and sometimes because I want to have them myself, and not be as beholden to sort of immediate market understanding. There's a question here from Yarman. How important are critiques? Which do you find more valuable, positive or negative feedback? I think constructive negative feedback is probably the best. I would say sort of that's wrong, or, you shouldn't do it that way, is not so useful. I really love what you've built is nice to hear. And sometimes when you see something that you've built and maybe a part of it, people are like, hey, that's really great. That's really great. That's really great. That's useful, because then to sort of expand that part. I think that maybe I'm somewhat thick-skinned about this. So for me, positive feedback is great. I think for me, the fact that the person giving the positive feedback is having a good time with the thing that I built is probably more important to me than that I feel, oh, that's so cool, somebody's giving me positive feedback type thing. I mean, it just happens to be my particular personality is that I sort of get a good feeling out of feeling that other people have a good feeling using what I built, more so than sort of the ego fueling or something of people saying, hey, what you built is really cool. That's nice, but that I think, and I suppose when it comes to kind of what you're doing is wrong, but I can't tell you how to fix it, or what you're doing is wrong, you should just fire all those people in that group because they're all idiots or whatever, that's not terribly useful. Now, I have to say one sort of amusing thing, a number of people that I've hired, I met because they kind of heckled in some sense, or sort of gave, how can that possibly be right type feedback, or, in talks I was giving. And it's sort of been a personal amusement of mine that some really great people that I've hired over the years, some of them who've been with the company for a really long time, I met because they heckled talks I was giving. And generally what I find is sort of when people come into the company, kind of maybe eager beavers of various kinds, and they'll say, this is wrong, you should do it differently, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Usually it's like, or more commonly, what you're doing is wrong, but I can do it better for you. It's kind of like, okay, the first time they say that, you say, okay, great, go do it. And if they come back and it's great, then it's wonderful. If it's like 2-3 times of oh, that's wrong, you can do it better, and so on, but then doesn't really work, then you kind of lose interest in that, and it's not, that's probably not a great story going forward. So I think it's partly where is the feedback coming from, and what's the track record of the person giving the feedback, and are they being constructive, and are they saying, hey, I can fix this, or are they just saying, hey, I've got some homework for you, this is wrong, type thing. I mean, I have to say, when when one sees things from people where they sort of say, you should be doing X, Y, and Z, and it's like, yeah, sometimes those are good suggestions, but when it's kind of like, or no, more to the point, it's, why haven't this set of customers used your products more? And it's like, I don't know. I mean, if you're defining that question, it'd be great to get some feedback on that, and something constructive where it's like, here's how you solve that, rather than just this is broken type thing. Yeah, I would say Weasel is commenting that they like real feedback where you pick apart what's going on and help fixing problems. I have to say, I give lots of feedback to people. And one of my sort of principles about that is it's not useful to just say this is wrong, ever. It's it's like you have to dive in and get down in the details. Sometimes you say, hey, can we make it do this or that? And the person says, yeah, I think I can do that. If they say, no, I don't know how to do it, it's impossible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, then you kind of have to dive down into the details. And if you do, people learn from that. And the next time it's like, well, they think about going down to those details as well. I mean, I think also sort of, illustrating how to think about certain kinds of things, for if you're leading an organization or something, illustrating how to think about things in a very practical way with the things we're actually thinking about right now is super useful. I mean, here's a trade-off people often sort of come to, which is, you're talking to some people and you say, well, this isn't, what you've done isn't quite right, and you should do this or that instead. And they say, oh, it's impossible, or whatever else. Now, the question is, do you let them kind of hang out there trying to do these things? Or do you, if you know what to do you just dive into the details and help them, show them how to do it? So probably before about 20 years ago, I would have said, I let them try and do their thing, because that's how they grow, is by trying to do things and it doesn't quite work out, and they learn from that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I have concluded that that is just not the right approach. If you as a leader know what to do, just go do it and show them what you're doing, and they can learn from that. And, the idea that if you jump in and just do it, that one of several things could happen. One thing that could happen is they get lazy and they just figure you're always going to come in and do it. But it's not so hard to signal this isn't you can't, call the CEO to solve that problem every time it comes up. So that's usually not a huge problem. The other is that which sort of related to that is, they don't feel empowered to solve the problems themselves, because one's just coming in and telling them what to do. That's not really so much of an issue. And it's way overpowered by the phenomenon of the leader, the CEO, whatever, actually has an understanding of what the engineer, the whatever it is, does. And that is something which I think, I don't know, my impression is people appreciate the fact that the CEO both knows a reasonable amount about what they do and cares about what they do. The fact that the CEO, who happens to have, 45 years of experience in the tech industry, can solve a problem that the person with 2 years of experience cannot, is not personally ego crushing to that person. It's something where it's kind of yes, I can learn from that and, have a path forward type thing. That's a much more important effect. And I think, and I do this quite often, whenever it's kind of like, whenever I think I can dive in, whenever there's some problem that people haven't solved, and at some point I'll just dive in and try and get into the details. I think, when was it? It was just a few days ago. It was a show me the code moment, where what was happening. Gosh, I can't even remember. I remember who showed me the code. They're a highly competent person. And I don't really quite remember why it was a show me the code moment. But it worked out well because we could easily see something where it was like, hey, is this really possible? Well, actually, yes, it is. Let's see. Devin asks the question, says they've been rewatching the interview, the discussion I just did with Eliezer Yudkowsky. Asks, do you enjoy those types of interactions? I do. I mean, I don't know what type of interaction means. I like talking to interesting people. I'm one of those people who if I'm sitting next to somebody on a plane, check whatever, I'll usually, unless I'm super busy, I'll end up talking to them, and I find that interesting. And it's you learn a little slice of something in the world, and I always find it interesting. That's sort of just the random person you meet out there in the world type thing. But in terms of sort of discussions with people who've thought deeply about lots of different topics, that's usually interesting. The only time it gets a little difficult is when everybody has a shtick. And you end up in a discussion where somebody says their shtick, and then you say your shtick, and it doesn't really engage. And that's not terribly interesting to me, at least. It's not interesting when I end up having to trot out some kind of shtick that I have. Usually I've heard the shtick or know something about the shtick of the other person, but when it really is a back and forth engaged discussion where you're talking about things that probably neither person has in detail thought about in exactly that way before, I think it's great. I learn things from it. I also find that in the case of the discussion with Eliezer, we're probably coming at the question of sort of, will the AIs destroy our species, so to speak? We're probably coming at that with different prior assumptions. And when one can have a sort of an open-minded discussion with people about anything, that's pretty interesting. I mean, I think there are topics where people are so kind of, I'm just convinced, I believe this is what I believe, nothing you can say will ever shift that. That's not so interesting. It feels like when you can actually have kind of a more open discussion, that gets interesting. And when people really care about the things that their side of the discussion, that's fine, so long as they're sort of capable of having an actual open discussion about things. Let's see. Okay. Machiavelli asks, how do you balance maintaining the integrity of your original idea while incorporating customer feedback, which is often influenced by their familiarity with previous incomparable solutions? I must admit that I'm a bit arrogant and egotistical about this. I kind of believe that, particularly because I'm a user of the products we build, that I kind of know best what I think should be in the product. And what happens with customer feedback is, first of all, watch what they do, not what they say. In other words, if they offer the opinion, oh, you should do this, this, and this, that's much less valuable than just saying, what do you actually do? Do you actually find that you use this or that thing? Saying that this or that thing is great. Have you used it? Well, no, it just sounded great, but I haven't actually used it. So, I think that I have to say at times when I've asked questions to some of our customers and longtime customers, and they say, should we do this or that? They say to me, you know what? You're better at making that decision than we are. Just go with what you think should happen. And they're not necessarily wrong, because one's been deep inside the thing. As I say, it's important that in the case of our product, that the people who are leading our company use the product. So that's an important feedback loop to make the product great. Is that that we are users of our own product, so to speak. And I think you often get led astray by just like customer X asked for this feature, customer Y asked for that feature. Pretty soon you're gluing in all those random features. They don't fit together because customer X never talked to customer Y. And really, it's, I see products where I know this was a product created in response to customers, and it's a total mess. And, it's going to sort of topple over of its own confusion, so to speak. So, if you're a user of your own product, just build the product you think you should build. And because you know what you want, because you're using it, because you're much deeper involved in that product than anybody else will be, and you have a better kind of vision for the whole thing. I have to say, when people ask me, people who lead companies that make products that I end up using, they say, how could we make the product better? And I think a lot about product design, and I'm sort of often embarrassed because I kind of freeze and I say, I don't really know. I haven't really thought about that. I've just been using your product. I haven't been sort of thinking about how to make it better. Now, there are a few cases where I'll say, look, actually, usually cases where I'm not using their product, but where I know if it just had that one extra feature, I would use that product. And that maybe is more useful feedback. But I think, trust your own, if you're using your product, trust your own opinions about how the product should be better. And, watch what users actually do. If you find, oh, this particular sub feature of your product, there's just lots of people really using that, that's a thing to pay attention to. Lola asks, do you have a favorite interview podcast speech that you've done, one that you're most proud of? Not really. I've done lots, and sometimes they work great, sometimes they don't work so well. I have to say, I always notice, like I did one a few days ago that was a remote talk where the content was great, but it was the first thing I did in the morning, and I really wasn't awake. And, the presentation could have been a lot better. But, for me, I find it really helps to have some sense of the audience, and some synergy, chemistry, whatever, with the audience. And for you guys, it really helps me, even though I can't see you all, the fact that I kind of get some feedback from the kinds of questions people are asking is sort of that lets me sort of make progress on that. But I think, most of the time, almost everything I do is pretty much off the cuff. I'm pretty bad at, I don't end up having either usually the time and it's not clear it's an advantage to sort of prepare, talks I'm going to give and so on. I find it works better if it's somewhat spontaneous. It has more life to it, and that's what I tend to do. I have to say, a few times I've been so time constrained in some talk that I've agreed to give that I've ended up having to prepare it. A couple of times I've done talks for TED, which have this strange, whatever it is, 18-minute kind of time constraint. And then I've simply written those talks out. I just wrote it out. As I wrote it, there were things where I can say it longer. Oh, I have to redo those 2 sentences to make it shorter and so on. And, then for when I've given those talks, I just read the talks. I think I do okay just reading things that I've written, but it's probably less dynamic than when I'm doing something off the cuff, but it has the advantage that it fits in the time that's available. And probably those talks, in terms of kind of content per word, those are a very carefully sort of optimized for content per word. I'm not sure that optimizes the final presentation. I think when it comes to kind of interviews I've done, it's always interesting. I mean, when I'm being interviewed, there are interviewers who just managed to draw out of me much more interesting things than other ones. I think the ones where kind of they have a real curiosity about the things I'm talking about, that's important. And I find the same thing in the rare cases where I'm interviewing other people. I find that, I can do that well when I'm really interested in what they have to say, and when I'm just sort of asking questions that are driven by curiosity. That's what seems to work. Let's see. Harry is commenting here. Are you aware that with these weekly live streams, you basically invented the perfect brain workout? No, I'm not aware. Thanks for that piece of feedback. It's for me, it's a great brain workout. I hope people find it something which leads to some useful thinking. It certainly does for me. Anon is asking, is there a topic or question you wish more podcast hosts would ask you that they often overlook? Well, one thing that happens is people ask me things which they think are somehow easy technical questions, but they're not. They're deep, complicated questions. I mean, there was one podcast I was just on, very recently, where somebody says, well, I want to start with something easy. I think it was for a television show. So this particular thing will probably end up on the cutting room floor, so to speak. And they were saying, I just want to ask, an easy question first. Why is it that mathematics seems to be so unreasonably effective in science? And I'm like, that's not an easy question. I've written a lot about that. I've thought a lot about that. That's a long form essay. That's not an easy question. And sometimes people assume that things that one's talked about a lot, one has kind of a slick soundbite, and that's all one has to say about it. And in my experience of the kinds of things I think about, that's very rarely the case. Very rare that I can compress, 5 years of working on some science project into the sort of 15-second soundbite. In terms of things that they should ask more about, I mean, I think one of the main things, I suppose, is things that people haven't asked about before. I mean, I think there are, I've done lots of different kinds of interviews, from ones that are fairly technical to ones that are more sort of life and timesy to ones that are more some oral histories. Those can be interesting when they're done well. And certainly those expose things that I had not thought about before. I'll give you an example. Actually, I was talking to some historians of science who happened to be studying some early efforts of mine. I'd sort of given them a challenge. I said, they were interested in my sort of use of computers in physics in the late 1970s. And I was like, I was mostly, when I was doing that, I was doing algebra by computer and so on. That was a big early use that I had. And so my exercise, my sort of history of science exercise was, is there a connection between my sort of early adoption of sort of algebraic computation and my adoption of kind of and my studies of sort of the computational universe and what simple programs do and cellular automata and so on? Is there a connection between those two things? And it was kind of interesting because in talking to them, I realized, yes, there is a connection. I'd never seen this before in all these years. And the connection is this, that in doing sort of algebra by computer, you get to see all these algebraic forms and you start to have an intuition about how things come out algebraically. When you do sort of simple calculations with numbers on a computer, you're making a curve. Back in those days, we would, plot 3 or 4 data points, and there's not a lot of kind of grist for the intuition mill in that. But when you see kind of algebraic expressions, there's a lot of detail there that you can get an intuition. Oh, this kind of thing comes out in terms of polylogs. This thing will have a limiting form of that. And some of the early things that I wrote in particle physics and so on made use of those kinds of sort of algebraic intuition from seeing what a computer did. And so the thing I just realized last weekend when I was talking to these guys was, when I came to do kind of experiments on things like cellular automata, the idea that you could get intuition from seeing the output from a computer was something that was totally obvious to me. But I realized it was only obvious because I'd already seen that in the case of these things with algebra. So that was an interesting thing, which, if somebody had been poking at that in some interview, that would have been, for me at least, interesting. And by the way, as history as a guide to the future, that whole discussion made me all the more enthusiastic about seeing how can I actually use modern LLM AI technology to do things which are relevant to sort of research that I'm trying to push forward. And I don't really completely know the answer to that. I know that some things we've been building are super useful at a practical level for actually making things computational. But in terms of kind of the big picture of what's a type of thing I can study that I haven't been able to study before, I haven't quite figured that out yet, and I'm really curious to see that. Anon asks, what is something surprising people may not know about your day job? Oh, I don't know. What would I think there's some it takes a lot of it's intellectually complicated. One might have thought that, some people from a distance might have thought, oh, you're building software. It's kind of an engineering project, and it's kind of like you just put all these pieces together. But at least the way I do it, it's certainly as intellectually challenging as anything I do in science and those kinds of areas. It's kind of like drill down to the essence of things. That's what you have to do. And I suppose what I tend to do in everything I do in sort of setting strategy for the business and so on, that's really the challenge is drill down to the essence. What is the point? How do we figure out what to do based on what we understand as sort of the core essence of what's happening? I mean, there are things about CEOing that are, I think, probably that are always kind of eye rolling in some level. One of the phenomena is which I always, the CEO becomes the central complaints department for people in all parts of the company, and it's so common that you'll hear from somebody, oh, this other part of the company that, is people they've been working with for a decade or more. Oh, they don't really do anything. Okay. Well, actually, I know they do, but it's like everybody is thinking hard about what they're doing, and what happens in another lane, so to speak, is not so visible to them. And so, with some personalities, they're going to assume what isn't in their lane isn't anything, so to speak. And so that's one of those dynamics that is kind of a little eye rolling for the CEO, but you kind of get used to it. Another thing, I suppose, in terms of the role of a CEO in a company is that there are often things that are happening in different parts of the company. And the question is, does A connect to B? And often the only part of the kind of org chart that in which those two parts of the company come together is with the CEO. And so I find myself really quite often being in the situation where it's like, hey, I'm telling one group at the company something about what another group at the company is doing. And that I think is a useful function, and it's an important function. And there are plenty of things to do. I suppose I'm reflecting on things I'm dealing with right now, but there are things where we've managed to grow several somewhat parallel products in development that are all quite good, but they're kind of like, wait a minute, how on earth do these fit together? And that's a typical sort of CEO challenge, which is kind of both a mixture of product design, understanding the essence of what's happening, understanding the market, and understanding the internal, often human dynamics of how you get these different teams to interact appropriately. All right, maybe one more, and then I need to go back to my day job. Let's see. Boy, there are all kinds of questions about the AI industry. Maybe I'll talk about that some other time. Okay, there's a question here from Raj saying, you've frequently written about your big digital archive. What tool do you use for indexing and searching? What other tools have you used or considered in the past? What's your opinion? You know, my meta searcher, as we call it, was built 25 years ago, and it's kept working. And it's mostly based on Lucene with a few other pieces added into it. And it's indexing all my email and files and other things, and I think transcripts from these live streams, all those sorts of things. It is my full intention to use vector databases and RAGs and LLMs on this. We've done some experiments. There's actually already a RAG that exists. We just released our semantic search capabilities in version 14.1 of Wolfram language. There is a RAG based on my sort of public writings that is available there, where I can kind of ask it things, but I haven't really started doing that myself. One thing that I really need, and actually I'm thank you for the reminder that this needs to get built, is I really want something that allows me to semantically search previous things I've written, because sometimes I'm writing something and it's like, I think I've written about this before. Maybe I don't need to write this here. I can just link to it. Although sometimes it's a horrible attractor. If you see what you wrote before, you have a hard time tearing yourself away from the words you wrote before to write words that really fit into what you're writing now. But knowing things I have written in the past, and probably I should do that on my email as well, of sort of reminding myself about things that I've done in the past. I mean, I do have automatic keyword searches that happen for example, email that comes into me, and searching for related mail, and it shows me that, and that's a pretty useful mechanism, a pretty useful way to recognize that that person who's now the CEO for a tech company was an intern with us back 25 years ago or something like this. Those are nice things to be able to connect together. All right, I think we should wrap up here. So thanks for joining me, and back I go to my day job, and I look forward to talking to you another time. Bye for now.